up to 17 billion Canadian dollars. And Canada's investment into China in the last 20 years has increased like 20-fold to be now at $12.7 billion, significant. Well, being a small country of 38 million people, Canada relies a great deal on foreign direct investment to build our economy, pay for our national health care, our educational system, and many of our social programs that we provide to Canadian citizens. We need foreign direct investment. China has a strong interest in Canada's natural resources to secure its long-term supply, and they have had, and they will continue to have a deep interest as well in Canadian technological expertise. However, Chinese investment in the country is controversial, and it has become more controversial in the last few years for a number of reasons. There are national security sensitivities that we pay more attention to around Chinese investment in critical resource sectors such as oil and gas and strategic metals. The Canadians are concerned about, sorry, I'll have to put my glasses on that one. The Canadians are also concerned about China's desire to use labor for projects that they have invested in, despite strict policies in Canada preventing this from happening. You see what's happening in Metro Montenegro right now with this highway where a lot of Chinese workers, have been doing a terrible job, and Montenegro is in deep problems. So in Canada, we're very strict about that. The Canadian public opinion on China is at its lowest point in recent memory. Canadian public opinion on China has gone down. We at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, we have that question on a free trade agreement with China. In 2020, polling for such a free trade agreement with China went down to 33% from 66% where it was in 2018. So it is collapsing. Only 11% of Canadians now support investment from Chinese state-owned companies. So Canada's challenge is to develop an independent approach to a new geopolitical reality, especially around the China-US superpower competition. And that is especially challenging for us in Canada. It is complicated by the fact of our geography, our friendship and very, very integrated economy with the United States. And it has always been very integrated, but more so since we have had the Canada-US free trade agreement and now with the Mexicans as well. So that is very challenging to develop our own approach with China, with the United States really now having a very challenging rivalry with China. Until recently, we had a very friendly relationship with Canada that has been beneficial for the United States. Pierre Trudeau's Canada recognized China before Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing. And there's a long history of great friendship between China and Canada that has been useful to our neighbor in the United States. So there will be increasing pressure applied by the United States for Canada to conform with United States policies on China, including on technology collaboration, academic research, investment regulations, and immigration. Canada will need to very carefully choose how best to align on geopolitical issues to ensure our own autonomy, our sovereignty, and the ability to pursue national interests. Managing inward investment from China will also be quite complex. There will be more scrutiny of Chinese investments, no matter the amount, in critical technology sectors for national security reasons. Canada has yet to make a decision whether to ban Huawei 5G equipment from our telecom networks, but the very uncertainty over Huawei 5G has already pushed Canadian telecom companies to procure competitor 5G equipment providers like Ericsson, Samsung, and Nokia for their networks. Huawei 4G equipment still exists in the Canadian telecom networks. So the experience in the 2013 and 14, the experience with the $15 billion purchase by Nexen by CNOOC left a bad taste in China's mouth. That really turned pretty sour for all kinds of reasons. But the annual amount of Chinese investment in Canada has remained the same since that purchase. And we also created amendments to our Invest in Canada Act. These amendments have been an increase in the thresholds for review of most acquisitions of over $1 billion in enterprise value. The manner in which state-owned enterprises will be defined, and the introduction of additional control in fact tests for acquisitions by the SOEs, essentially who really controls, who really runs the show of these companies when state-owned companies are involved. These have been amendments in the Act, as well as an extension to the timelines for national security reviews. So Canadian business still sees opportunity in China. They will continue to invest. They will be sensitive, of course, to the ESG issues. ESG issues are, of course, taking a lot more room for investors, for governments, and the Canadian business leaders more and more see ESG, and they will make decisions accordingly with China. But as I say, Canadian business continue to see the opportunity. It will be more delicate related to these issues. Chinese companies will continue to invest in Canada, but they will be careful to abide more strictly to the regulatory guidelines. They will want to assume minority positions, the question of the control of the company. And I think that they have learned that they should maintain sort of a low profile in the management of their operation and investments in Canada. So this is the situation as I see it at this time. Geopolitics is going to be extremely crucial in the future of that relationship that business will have to take into account more than ever. So politics is back. There would be more politics in the business exchanges in the last few years. And we're looking to see very much the way that President Biden will approach the whole subject. And he wants the whole alliance and the whole Western countries to be closer together in challenging China. It will be interesting to see how much discipline he demands, because for Canada, it's very important to maintain our sovereignty and our own autonomy vis-a-vis that very important relationship with the China that continues rising. I will stop here, Loreto. Gracias, muy amable.
Muchas gracias a ti, Pierre, por esta presentación y por compartir tu visión sobre cómo ha sido la experiencia de Canadá en su relación con China. Vamos a escuchar algunos aspectos que tú has tocado en otras de las presentaciones que van a hacer Longyan e Ignacio. Quisiera darle disculpas por el inicio abrupto. Estos son los pormenores que pasan con la tecnología. Les pido mil disculpas. Voy a aprovechar de presentarlos correctamente. Así que voy a volver un poquito atrás y seguimos enseguida con Longyan. Pierre Pettigrew es el presidente del Directorio de la Asia Pacific Foundation de Canadá y asesor ejecutivo de Deloitte, Canadá. Exministro de Relaciones Exteriores, de Comercio, de Salud y de Asuntos Intergubernamentales de Canadá, entre otros cargos ministeriales. Antes de trabajar en el gobierno, fue consultor internacional durante 10 años en Deloitte, donde emergió como una influyente voz para los negocios y como analista para asuntos del GATT, la Organización Mundial del Comercio y el Acuerdo de Libre Comercio de América del Norte. Encabezó varios grupos de trabajos en complejas negociaciones comerciales y lideró misiones comerciales a China, India, Rusia, Alemania, Marruecos, Sudáfrica, Nigeria y México, entre otros países. Luego, Longyan Shen es la directora de negocios del Asia Desk de Ernst & Young Chile. Cuenta con amplia experiencia internacional en las industrias de productos perecederos, minería, retail y tecnología, así como en las cadenas de suministro. Se unió a Ernst & Young Chile en 2019 para liderar proyectos y brindar soluciones a los clientes asiáticos de la compañía, después de trabajar en multinacionales en Estados Unidos, Reino Unido, China y Perú. Es licenciada en Economía del Instituto de Educación Física de Wuhan, con un máster en Psicología Organizacional y Social de la Escuela de Economía y Ciencias Políticas de Londres. Ignacio Tornero es profesor adjunto de la Universidad Católica de Chile, investigador asociado del Centro de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Católica de Chile y asociado senior en Carey, abogados. Es experto en legislación corporativa y comercial, fusiones y adquisiciones, reestructuraciones corporativas, inversión extranjera y en particular en asesorar a inversionistas chinos en Chile y a empresas latinoamericanas en sus negocios en China. Entre el 2013 y 2018 estuvo a cargo de la apertura y coordinación de Carey Business Consultancy en Shanghai Limited, la compañía de consultoría de negocios en China. Margaret Myers es la directora del programa Asia y América Latina del Diálogo Interamericano. Creó el grupo de trabajo de diálogo sobre China y América Latina en el 2011 para examinar la creciente presencia de China en la América Latina y el Caribe. También desarrolló la base de datos financiera China-América Latina, la única fuente de datos empíricos disponible públicamente sobre préstamos estatales chinos en Latinoamérica, lo que hizo en cooperación con la Global China Initiative en el Centro de Políticas de Desarrollo Global de la Universidad de Boston. Antes de llegar al diálogo, Margaret trabajó como analista de América Latina y China para el Departamento de Defensa de Estados Unidos. También trabajó como analista senior de China para la Science Applications International Corporation, como consultora del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, entre otras posiciones relevantes. Bueno, habiendo presentado como correspondía a nuestros distinguidos panelistas, le voy a dar ahora la palabra a Longyan para que hagas tu presentación. Muchas gracias, Longyan.
Muchas gracias, Loreto. Since the presentation is in English, so I thought I'm just going to go ahead and to go along with the theme Pierre have started. So I'm going to show my presentation. Let me know if everybody have good visual. Yes?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. So rather than, I think, to kind of give an opinion or a presentation, I rather think this is a discussion. To be honored to be here kind of talking about this topic of China and Chile. I thought I'll give shine a bit light on my humble personal opinion as a social psychology for LSE. At the same time, the experience that as EY, a professional Big Four, has been experiencing. And we did a very valuable survey with various our Chinese customers. And I thought it might be interesting to share those data. Just to give kind of today's world in a bit of a context, we're talking about Belt and Road initiatives, we're talking about the global diversities, and at the same time, we start to think, China is no longer the world factory, it is becoming the world consumer. At the same time, is its development today similar to the Japanese development in the 70s or the 80s, where the economy is fast developing? We're looking at this Belt and Road initiative definitely brought or achieved mutual beneficial relationship with certain emerging markets such as Southeast Asia. And we wonder, probably China is now looking at Latin America. So we, according to all of these interesting contexts, we looked into a quite large survey with our Chinese customers and contacts who definitely showed their interest in Latin America. So 63% of the correspondents definitely already have experience invested in Latin America. And among those who has not invested, who also showed interest, of course. At the same time, Chile stands out as the Latin American hub, which we definitely see ranking as the top #1. And just right after Chile, we see the interest of investing in as well in Brazil as in Mexico. Now, among all of these interests in Latin America, we see 27% of the correspondents that have not invested Chile have planned in the next 3 years. So we see Chile as hub of the Latin American investment, and especially as if it is an administration hub in order to have a visual of the whole Latin American market, considering our political stability, the regulations, and also, of course, the opportunity led by the market. Now, what is the way most of the Chinese investors are entering this market? Joint venture definitely top all of these options. And we wonder what is from the Chilean side, is the Chileans are interested in becoming these Chinese investment partners. As Loreto mentioned before, we honorably have the ex-president joining our webinar today. So just quoting his words, I think it definitely sets a positive tone from the Chilean government, from Invest Chile, and also from ex-presidents, all his work with Chile-China relationship. We see, of course, challenges, as Pierre just mentioned in his previous presentation, but at the same time, various positive opportunities, economical development, collaborations. Most of the industry the Chinese investment are focusing on, we find from the survey, is mostly in transportation, in logistics, infrastructure, energy, mining industry, which definitely is the core of the continent and Chile has to offer. Now, considering these challenges, we definitely heard various different perspectives. But if I can separate from, let's say, people side and from the hard regulation side, from people's side, there is definitely the distance between Chile and China. It's absolutely at the opposite of the globe. Now, from that sense, we do see the importance of getting to know each other simply and culturally have an exchange in order able to be adapt. And then from professional side, of course, or from tax perspective, regulation perspective, in order to comply with the local market. Just to sum up all the kind of survey results that we have studied and researched, we did find the 3 most important elements in this survey. First is from the regulation perspective. Chinese are always looking for security, for safety, in order not to have any troubles with the local compliance. At the same time, as I mentioned, from people's perspective, the factor that in order to people can adapt to each other, get to know each other, and be able to adapt, respect to one another is important for a very long-term harmonious relationship. From the market perspective, of course, being part of the local team network, industry in order to be authentic, keep on learning and respecting one another. And we think these are the core elements to consider. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Longyan, por tu análisis. Vamos a volver a algunos aspectos de tu presentación en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Ahora vamos a darle la palabra a Ignacio. Ignacio, tienes el piso para hacer tu presentación.
Loreto, can you all see the PPT? Okay, great. So thank you, Loreto. I would like to thank the Dialogue and la Fundación Chilena del Pacífico for this kind invitation. Also thank Pierre and Longyan for the great presentation. So my presentation will be 10 years of Chinese outward foreign direct investment, or FDI, in South America and Chile, past and future perspectives. This is containing the main findings of our research project that will be published as a chapter in a book that will be published by the Center for International Studies at Universidad Católica in the second term. As Loreto mentioned in her introduction, I've been assisting Chinese enterprises in their operations in South America for the last decade, and also researching the trends of Chinese FDI in the region since then. And back in 2011, my thesis when I was still at law school at Pontificia Universidad Católica was about Chinese investment in the region, Chinese FDI in Latin America, the Chilean case towards the strengthening of a strategic alliance. And my main thesis was that before 2010, there was not much Chinese FDI going into countries such as Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Chile. And however, in 2010, I identified what I mentioned like a turning point in the relationship between Chinese FDI in Latin America. At that time, 95% of Chinese FDI to the region went to the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, and Latin America and the Caribbean received 17% of the world total. So I wanted to revisit the situation of Chinese FDI in the region in order to understand what may have changed. We all know that many things have changed. We all know that there is a much bigger presence of Chinese companies in the region. First of all, we have to acknowledge that this phenomenon of Chinese FDI in the world is something pretty new. If we go back actually to 2002, there was not much Chinese FDI going overseas. Just to mention like a figure, 2.7 billion were invested back in 2002, which is not a lot of money. However, the trend changed pretty fast. We see what happened back in 2008, mainly because of the financial crisis. And Chinese investment overseas reached a peak back in 2016. We always need to see things in perspective. I also wanted to compare the situation of China with the ones of the United States, Japan, and Canada. And even though we may see that Chinese investment has been growing since 2002 in the last 2 decades, we had to recognize that it's still lagging behind the amounts of the US, for instance. When we study Chinese investment overseas, we always have to consider the role of the government, especially at the beginning. I always like to mention that Chinese investment started happening back in the late 90s because of this public policy called the Go Out policy that was launched back in 1999 by former President Hu Jintao. And behind this, there are several factors. It's a very complex policy considering both economic factors, political factors, macroeconomic factors, microeconomic factors. We also need to understand what was happening in Asia after the financial crisis. The Chinese market was becoming a more competitive market itself. Of course, there was also the need to find new clients overseas, risk pooling or diversification logic, the need of sourcing natural resources, the increasing sophistication of the Chinese consumer, the chance to position successful Chinese brands overseas, the construction of soft power, and even the next entry of China to the WTO. So what have been the preferred destination of Chinese OFDI? First of all, we have to again acknowledge that back in 2005, early 2000, there was not much activity of Chinese companies going overseas. But as you can see in this chart, that changed pretty fast. However, many people would say that probably the majority or a big bunch of Chinese OFDI is going to countries such as, or regions such as Africa or Latin America, but it's not the reality. If you see this information, we'll see that in terms of number of transactions, the region that is leading is Asia with 476. Then we have Europe with 426. And in the third position, we have North America with 359. What I mentioned before in my thesis is that in 2010, we see a turning point in the relationship or in the appearance of more Chinese OFDI into Latin America. Now, if we see the same information, but I would like to distinguish 4 stages in the relationship between OFDI, Chinese OFDI into the world. And the first one is 2010, the second one is 2016, then we have 2019 and 2020. The reason why I'm highlighting 2010 is because, as I said before, it was the first year in which South America reached the 3rd position as a receiver of Chinese OFDI, just behind the amounts of Asia and North America. 2016, as I said before in one of the first slides, it was the first year, it was the year in which Chinese investment reached its peak. And as you can see in these, the blue and yellow and purple bars, the regions that were receiving more transactions of Chinese FDI were developed regions, such as North America, and in the second place was Europe, and then Asia. However, the situation has been changing since the trade war or the trade conflict started with the US back in 2018. And as you can see in 2018, the situation changed in 2 main ways, which is the Chinese OFDI started decreasing. And at the same time, we see that the regions in which Chinese investment is focusing are changing as well. We see that Asia is going to the 1st position, Europe is going to the 2nd one, North America is going to the 3rd one, with South America and almost receiving the same amount of transactions. What's been happening with COVID-19, we see that this decreasing trend is been going further as well. And at the same time, you can see that the blue bar, which represents North America, it's almost close to 0. We can reach to the same conclusion when we not just consider the number of transactions, but when we consider the total USD amount dollars invested overseas. And as you can see in this map, you will see that Europe has been the region in the world that has received more Chinese investment in terms of USD terms. The second one is Asia, and then we have North America in the 3rd position. South America with 129 billion USD of Chinese OFDI is just 25% above like the amount received by Australia as a single economy. So that gives you an idea that South America, even though it's been receiving more Chinese investment, has not received a lot of Chinese investment, historically speaking. When we focus in South America, we will see that countries such as Brazil, Peru, and then Chile have been the main receivers of Chinese investment. However, Brazil has received almost 50%, while Peru a little bit more than 20%. In my research project, I like to call the case of Chile like a late phenomenon of Chinese investment in our region. Again, if we go and see in this chart what happened back in 2005, we see that there weren't many operations of big operations of Chinese enterprises here, just 2. However, the situation changed, as I said before, since 2010, where we start seeing a more active participation of Chinese companies in countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela. However, in the case of Chile, it took until 2016 and mainly 2018 to start receiving more Chinese OFDI into our country. It is important to say that this trend is not very consistent with the general OFDI activity into South America. Why? Because Chile, if we consider the overall foreign investment between 2005, 2019, we will see that it's in the 2nd position just behind Brazil, almost doubling the amount received by Argentina and countries like Peru. So I'm trying to explain in this research project why Brazil and why Peru have been receiving more Chinese investment and why they did so in an earlier stage. Of course, there are several factors that are very complex. It's very tough to say like what's the critical factor explaining this logic. But I would like to share some insights with you, such as like the FDI attraction strategy started by Brazil back in 2004, a more government-to-government dynamic in the cases of Brazil and Peru. It was also in the case of Brazil, the previous experience of Chinese companies and the logic of Guanxi and expected higher return on investment, and of course, the size of the market, number of the population. And in the case of Peru, we have also, I would like to mention this Chinese migration component, because like some scholars, they say that between 3 and 9% of the population in Peru, they have Chinese origin. Again, the case of Chile, we can say that it's a late phenomenon in terms of Chinese investment. We see that not much happened between 2012 and 2016 and 17. However, this trend has been changing pretty fast. We see in this chart that back in 2018, Chinese investment reached its peak, and it was at the same year when China was the first foreign investor in our country. And that may explain why many people may think that Chinese investment in Chile is historically high, which is not the reality. So that's the reason why I would like to show here that the main historical investors in Chile have been the United States, Spain, and Canada. And if you see the historical stock, I mean, for the US, Spain, and Canada is all, I mean, roughly the same amount. There are 3 times the amount of Chinese investment in our country. In terms of like the main areas of investment, I always like to make the distinction between big transactions. What I mean about that is like over 100 million USD and smaller transactions. In the case of Chile, we see that there is a balanced situation of capital flows going to the energy sector and metals, almost 50% each. And this is very consistent to the situation what we see of Brazil. And in Brazil, we see 70% going to the energy sector, and in Peru, 67% is mining, and 29% is going to the energy sector. And this is also consistent with the situation in the world between 2005 2012. And there are some scholars saying that the logic in that period behind Chinese investment is mainly explained by an energy diplomacy logic. This in order to guarantee certain resources that are critical for the Chinese development. However, if we consider smaller transactions of less than 100 million USD, we will see a definitely more diversified trend. In terms of the ownership structure of the companies, I again would like to make the distinction between big transactions and small transactions, because in big transactions, we do see a more presence of the Chinese government, which is roughly the same, not just in Chile, but in the whole region of a 70% state-owned, 30% private entities. However, for small transactions, this is a more balanced situation, almost 60% state-owned, 40% or 50-50. And if we analyze the structure of the Chinese economy, we will see that this trend is also consistent with that, because we will see a more presence of the government in strategic industries. I've been advising Chinese corporations in their entry to the Latin American market for almost a decade. And I took part in a research project back in 2016 made by the China Going Global think tank, trying to identify the main risks affecting Chinese companies going overseas. And they came out with 30 risks. In my professional experience, I've seen 18 of them in our clients related to the experience, the use of advisors, the strategy and planning, the performance, and others. However, in terms of like the main challenges ahead, and some was mentioned by Pierre before, I would like to sum them up in 3 main challenges ahead. The first one is FDI screening situation happening in the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, and maybe thinking about having like CFIUS-like agencies and this national security concept. Then there's the issue of the state-owned enterprises and related antitrust risks. And in many examples, in many cases in Latin America, there's not a well understanding of how state-owned enterprises usually are managed on a daily basis. And as Pierre was saying before, the sustainability challenge, and this is like the debt trap diplomacy. To finalize my presentation, I would like to share with you how the trade war, the trade conflict between the US and China, and COVID-19 have been affecting Chinese FDI into the region. And we see in the case of South America, this has been affecting it pretty heavily since 2018. However, the situation in Chile has been more resilient. We see that in 2018, in the middle of the trade war between the US and China, Chinese FDI reached its peak. And we see that even though the COVID-19 has been affected Chinese FDI, it's not affecting as much as we can see in other regions. Of course, we can also consider political and other factors. What to expect regarding Chinese FDI in Chile? I would say that China will probably keep being one of the main FDI players, along with traditional ones such as the US, Canada, and Spain. We will probably see a more diversification in terms of industries, going more capitals to agribusiness, infrastructure, technology, education, science, and finally, a more balanced participation of SOEs and private-owned enterprises. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Ignacio, por esa información desagregada y con estadísticas y que nos permite tener una visión de cómo ha sido la evolución de la inversión de China en la región y en Chile particularmente durante los últimos años. Voy a darle la palabra ahora a Margaret, que va a hacer algunos comentarios a partir de las presentaciones hechas por ustedes. Margaret, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Loreto. And thank you, to the Chile Pacific Foundation, which has been a wonderful partner for us, and indeed to the esteemed panelists for the excellent remarks. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I'll be very quick in my sort of commentary. I want to highlight a few points, but I want to allow enough time for us to dig into some of the more recent deals that we've seen happening in Chile, and perhaps, receive some of the panelists' thoughts on where China might focus in the coming months, specifically at an industry level, and on some developments in Chile in particular, such as constitutional reforms and other factors that could affect Chinese and other engagement. And your thoughts on those, I think, would be invaluable to many in the audience. A first point I want to make just very quickly is that this has always, the Chile-China relationship, but the China-Latin America relationship has always been a co-produced phenomenon, a co-produced relationship. And this is the case now more than ever as China engages far more extensively at the local level, with municipalities in many cases, marketing key technologies and other services to municipalities, to provinces or states, sometimes even very small towns and cities, right? And so increasingly we're seeing a much wider range of actors, Chilean and Chinese, or broader Latin American and Chinese, engaging in deal making. And that is shaping the landscape in these relationships in new ways and creating new opportunities for deal making in some very interesting sectors. And I see this as a sort of novel development. It's not an entirely new thing, but we're seeing a much greater focus on this particular element or form of engagement of late. And so it would be interesting to know whether, the panelists indeed agree with me on that point, or whether that is indeed shaping the way in which we are seeing deals struck and the types of deals that we're seeing struck now and perhaps in the coming months and years. And with that in mind, I think it's also worth noting that so much, of course, depends on what's happening in China at present, right? Considering that this is indeed co-produced, and Longyan Shen mentioned this of a few, sort of critical factors. What will happen in China in the coming months and years in both sort of political and economic terms, right? How will China handle its debt-related challenges at home, right? That's a big question, especially amid and post-COVID-19. Will that affect the ability of China's development banks, China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank, to lend overseas in support of the Belt and Road Initiative? We've seen a real drop in sovereign lending, but a sort of rise in commercial finance in the region from banks like ICBC, Bank of China, which are indeed active in Chile as well. How will the BRI itself, the Belt and Road Initiative itself, transform it is an organic thing, right? And the definitions of the Belt and Road do tend to shift over time. We've seen a few offshoots of the Belt and Road of late. The Health Silk Road, for example, has sort of reemerged as a prominent thing amid COVID-19, unsurprisingly, with China, demonstrating its capacity in biotechnology, which could indeed affect the nature of investment in Chile and other places in the coming years. Also the Digital Silk Road, right, which is yet another component of the BRI, and which is one in which I think we'll see a lot of activity, right, not just in Chile, but across the entire region. And many of you have already alluded to this. What's happening with China's, reform-related and other policies at home? What were the effects, for example, of China's stimulus? Will it indeed be the case that industries that are promoted or that have been supported by China's government will be those that are relatively well-positioned to pursue opportunities at home and abroad? And here I'm speaking specifically about industries in the so-called new technology, right, industries. Things like electricity transmission, where we've already seen a surge in activity in Chile and other places, right? Also tech, artificial intelligence, right, telecommunications, things of this nature, and even services are wide-ranging. Other services are becoming quite, prolific across the region. What does the 14th five-year plan mean for China, China, Latin America, and Chile-China relations? Certainly there is more of a focus, as several of you have mentioned, on ESG, right, or corporate social responsibility. Pierre mentioned this, in the Canadian context, but Ignacio did too. But at the firm level, what's happening, right? We're seeing a lot of high-level pronouncements, but is this translating to the company level? And that's the really big question. We see a lot of commitment, and have for a very long time, as Yonglong mentioned, to compliance, but will it go beyond that? Will we see much more of a commitment to ESG sort of 2.0, right? As many sort of international companies are adopting at this place. And then there's the domestic political economy factors that shape all of this in Latin America and Caribbean too, right? And of course, in Canada as well, Pierre, what factors on the ground will be supportive of more engagement or else limiting of more engagement? How will they shape what China is doing in the region? And, on the latter point, will China see Latin America in recovery as an attractive investment environment, including in comparison to other regions in the world? Obviously, Latin America, as we saw in Ignacio's slides, is not the only investment region where China is heading, and is often not the top one. Will it be able to compete with other regions in the coming months? Africa, for example, Southeast Asia, and so on. And then there's the question of perceptions, and this is one also that Ignacio sort of noted. Many are interested in more engagement from China. Indeed, I think will be post-COVID-19. This will be a really critical moment for many countries in the region. But we've also seen some concern, some alarm about extensive, dependence on China, frankly, in a wide range of areas, whether it be trade or in terms of investment in certain critical sectors. Ignacio mentioned antitrust risks, right? This is not just a Chile phenomenon, of course. We're seeing these concerns articulated across the Latin American and Caribbean region. And, I think with all of this in mind, and please, I hope that our panelists will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but most of the analysts that I've spoken with expect a real surge in any case, right, in Chinese activity, not just in Chile, but in other places in the near term, primarily though through mergers and acquisitions in those traditional sectors, right, that Longyan mentioned, right, mining, for example, a lot of extractives, infrastructure development of various sorts, but also in those industries or in the exportation of technologies and technological services, which have, in many cases, a sort of quicker return on investment, which is of critical importance to China, sort of as China also emerges from the COVID-19 crisis, albeit in a much better economic position than a lot of other countries and economies in the world. And then finally, the last factor is the US one. From what I can tell so far, I see continued concern about the extent of Chinese investment in parts of the region, but something of a real sea change in the way that the Biden administration is viewing possible competition with China in the region, noting that more in the way of targeted economic engagement in Latin America taking into account, of course, you know, the SDGs, right? Sustainable Development Goals, and existential challenges in the region, things like climate change, is indeed the very best way to ensure strong US-Latin America ties with China in mind or not, right? So we'll see how all of this plays out, how it's applied in practice, but I do see a very, very fundamental shift in thinking about China and US-China competition in Latin America, albeit with continued concerns about China's engagement in certain specific areas. And I'll leave it there and very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Margaret, por tus comentarios y complementación a lo ya presentado por nuestros panelistas también. No sé si ustedes tienen algún comentario a lo expresado por Margaret, Longyan o Ignacio o Pierre, o pasamos a las preguntas y respuestas que tenemos de nuestra audiencia. Si no hay comentarios, vamos a ir viendo qué preguntas tenemos hoy día. Hay una pregunta que tiene que ver con la situación actual en Chile hoy día, de Daniel Liebetreux, y dice, how will the uncertainty surrounding the rewriting of the Constitution impact Chinese investment in Chile? Do the Chinese view it as an opportunity as European and North American investment slows? No sé quién quiere tomar esta pregunta. A lo mejor Ignacio o Longyan, no sé, Ignacio, que tú estás.
Sure, no problem, Loreto, and thank you for the question. In my opinion, like, of course, Chinese companies, both private and state-owned companies, they've been very involved, and they are very looking forward to understand like the recent challenges and how the process has been structured so far. However, from my own perspective and experience, advising Chinese, both private or state-owned, they don't see it as a high risk or as a let's say, like a reason to leave the country, because they think and they see that the fundamentals of the economy, I would say, respect of private property and the overall system and stability of institutions will probably stay the same. At the same time, Chinese, I mean, all these investments are big investments, and they are looking for the mid-long term. And the reason why they enter Chile is because they see it as a stable economy. And in their perception and the way the constitutional process has been structured so far, they see it in a very positive way. In the firm, we've been doing like a roadshow with another Latin American firms from Brazil, Peru, and Argentina, trying to explain the main kind of like political changes we are being suffering, and the social unrest in Chile that started back in 2019, and the constitutional process in Chile. And we've been talking with law firms and with clients directly, and they see it in a very positive way. So I would say, as a sum up, I wouldn't say that Chinese companies would leave the country or they would stop investing in Chile because we are drafting a potential new constitution. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio.
I think if you allow me on this one, if you have to look at the competition you have. Chileans look extremely well organized. We were surprised 2 or 3 years ago with the challenges that all of a sudden Chile seemed to be encountering. But for the Chinese, if you look at it, if you compare Brazil's leadership and challenging with the government and the ways it's going, if you look at Argentina and that situation, and if you look at Mexico, you still think Chile looks fantastic.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for that optimistic view. It's wonderful that you see us like that. Being Chileans, we are very critical of ourselves, many times more than it should be, but well, we're very happy that that's the way that you see us from outside. There's a question for you, actually, Pierre. It says, what would you say are the lessons learned by Canada in its relations with China, and which would be your recommendations for Latin America in that sense? it's more or less what was about your presentation, but they want to have a 1, 2, 3 kind of few tips.
As I say, we've always had a very friendly relationship with China, and on the whole, there was a great deal of trust, and it was unfortunately taken away in the last few years. So it will depend, of course, on how things evolve in the next few years. We have learned to be vigilant about the control of the companies. And we will be more vigilant in the future to make sure that when the Chinese invest in Canada, they continue to have minority control, and that the visible management not be Chinese. And it is for their own good, in the sense that if you want development, it's better this way. We also need to be very vigilant about intellectual property. This is something we've learned in some of the associations with Chinese investments in Canada around the technology. But I do believe that despite these vigilances, it is still very important to be open to those investments, and at the same time doing it, however, in a way that we continue to maintain our autonomy and our sovereignty. And it'll be a balancing act because of our very close relationship to the United States here.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for that. Let me see, there's another question here. I don't know who wants to take it, maybe Felipe or Ignacio, sorry, or Longyan. It says, ¿cómo la provisión china de vacunas contra el COVID-19 y otros insumos médicos, así como la alianza para desarrollar las vacunas, pruebas en personas, ha cambiado la relación con Chile y América Latina? ¿Hay realmente un punto de inflexión en esto? No sé quién quiere tomar esta pregunta.
I'm happy to do so if neither.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret.
I think we were fortunate to have a meeting just a few weeks ago with Fundación Chilena del Pacífico about China's engagement and COVID-19 diplomacy in Latin America, and have done some research since then. And you know, I think overwhelmingly, right, when you speak to audiences in the Latin American and Caribbean region, there's a tremendous degree of gratitude for, you know, for China's engagement early on, and the extent of, you know, of vaccines that have indeed been sold to, in some cases, very limited cases, donated to Latin American and Caribbean nations at a really critical moment. That said, it's unclear how much really, you know, vaccine diplomacy, aside from, you know, personal gratitude, has affected overall views of the China-Latin America relationship. There is some commentary surfacing about, you know, suggesting that in the case of Brazil, at least, and perhaps elsewhere in the region, that we are seeing a real fundamental shift in the way that Brazilians view, you know, the U.S. in comparison to China in particular, but also just China in its own right, seeing it as a much stronger partner. But we also did our own analysis of this through a program called Twitter mining, right, or a process called Twitter mining, wherein we looked at all of the tweets pre-COVID and during COVID referencing China and all of the words used in those tweets, right? And so we looked at sort of perceptions among folks who use Twitter in the Latin American region. And we did some sentiment weight analysis on those words that were used in those tweets. And we found that in general, you know, there were negative words used and positive words used, about, you know, 50-50, were 50% negative, 50% positive. But in general, they were more emotionally weighted. So there was a stronger view of negative view of China, and at the same time, a stronger positive view of China. This was especially apparent in Brazil, but also apparent across the entire region. So based on that analysis, right, it suggests that views of China, which have always been about 50-50, right? 50% positive, 50% negative on average across the entire region, haven't changed all much, but there's a much stronger emotional reaction as concerns China, and more tweeting about China, suggesting that China perhaps has a more extensive, or their views that China has a more profound or extensive impact on one's personal life in the Latin American and Caribbean region. But I think much more remains to be done in terms of analysis on this particular topic.
Muchas gracias, Margaret, por esa completa respuesta. Algo me mencionaste tú, Margaret, sobre el Belt and Road Initiative, a pesar de que no fue mencionado explícitamente en las presentaciones, pero es un mecanismo de inversión que ha usado China en muchos países y está usándolo para desarrollar su proyecto del Belt and Road. Y hay una pregunta acá que dice, how does China's engagement with Chile advance Belt and Road and other objectives? I don't know, maybe Margaret, you have more views on that, given that you spoke about Belt and Road Initiative. Y voy a complementar un poco lo del Belt and Road Initiative. La experiencia de algunos países en Asia, en particular en el caso de Malasia, por ejemplo, donde hubo inversiones en infraestructura a partir del Belt and Road Initiative, esto llevó a que parte del desarrollo de esta inversión, al desarrollar la infraestructura, trajo problemas de mano de obra. ¿Por qué? Porque China llevaba a sus propios trabajadores, eso produjo problemas laborales al interior de Malasia, en fin. Pensando desde esa perspectiva y la relación que puede haber entre China y Chile utilizando el Belt and Road Initiative, ¿qué ves tú o qué riesgos ves tú de que haya problemas regulatorios o algunas medidas que debamos tener nosotros en consideración? O a lo mejor el Belt and Road Initiative en el caso de China y Chile va a ser más por el lado de lo digital que en infraestructura, como ha sido en el caso de otros países alrededor de China.
I'll defer to Longyan or Ignacio, but I'm happy to make some comments if either of you would like to go first, by all means. No, okay. I'll just let me just say simply that, you know, as I mentioned before, the Belt and Road Initiative, and I would hardly claim to be an expert on the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's an ever evolving initiative, right? The definition changes quite extensively from one obviously that was very narrowly geographically focused to one that is now entirely global in its ambit, with the Latin American region being incorporated in 2018 and Chile having signed now a Belt and Road Cooperation Agreement, which makes it a formal member essentially for all intents and purposes of the Belt and Road Initiative. Neighboring countries have, of course, not. Argentina, for example, has yet to sign. Brazil too, Colombia, others, or other countries in South America at the very least. So what I would say also is that, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative tends to be viewed as an infrastructure project, right? But it is so much more than that. It is, or at least as described in Chinese and other documents as an connectivity enhancing initiative, right? And that connectivity is defined in different ways. There is financial integration, there's trade integration, there's of course, you know, connectivity that is the result of infrastructure development. But another very important aspect of this is people-to-people connectivity. And what we see happening in Chile is really an effort to advance all of these areas of engagement. So not just infrastructure development, or not just development, but we see acquisitions, right? Obviously of infrastructure assets, such as in the electricity transmission sector, but also extensive employment of human resources, both, you know, official government resources, representatives, but also civil society type actors, sort of pseudo quasi-governmental organizations such as the CCPIT, which is, you know, a trade promotion organization, and others that are engaging across Chile, right, in all sorts of different places to facilitate and advance Chinese interests, most of them commercial in nature, but also some of them political and otherwise oriented. And so in many ways, I mean, the activity is extensive. I tend to think that most everything that Chinese state-owned enterprises in particular, and Chinese government entities do, is indeed supportive in some form or another of the Belt and Road Initiative, just given how broadly and it is defined, right? But yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of activity, and it indeed checks a lot of these sort of boxes, these connectivity related boxes that are indeed BRI associated. And so I think we'll see more, think we'll see more in the digital space, more in the health Silk Road space, and indeed more in infrastructure, primarily acquisition, but perhaps also some greenfield investment. But all of this broadly supportive of the BRI.
Yes, I thought, just to add on Margaret's point, just like Loreto mentioned about the Belt and Road Initiative example in Malaysia, I think it's a perfect example that these professional companies such as EY or other Big Four consulting firms could definitely help to set the right structure, the right compliance for the company to do the right things for the human beings in general. Now, rather than from perspective of professional companies and structure perspective, I would say down to earth, like Margaret mentioned, it's people-to-people connection. I think it's a matter of the fact that one another need to respect and then learn from each other to adapt. And as a Chinese myself, I thought it took me quite a bit of a longer time, I thought, to adapt to Chile. I thought I had international background and education in different countries, and I thought it's gonna be okay to adapt. But it took longer than I thought, and with time passes, I'm already in Chile for 6 years. Now, I think the reason why the Chinese government in a way used the word of Belt and Road is trying to make it familiar from historical perspective. People have heard about Silk Road, and I think it's kind of a cultural standing. Let people to open this window of getting to know the Chinese culture, Chinese people. And I think it can be an interesting point to discover the unknown, and maybe when we know a bit unknown, we'll feel more secure and we'll have a lot balanced and dialogue with one another.
Loreto, let me add something on top of that. I mean, I think it's also important to consider that Latin America at the beginning was not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was more like a kind of like a reaction by Latin American governments to asking China if they could be considered inside the Belt and Road Initiative. At least from my professional experience, I wouldn't say that the main force behind investments coming from China are inside the framework of the Belt and Road. I mean, I would say that more market driven. And I definitely agree with Margaret. When would you say that something is part of the Belt and Road Initiative and when not, right? If you say, for example, a company such as like Didi, which is a private company investing in Brazil or Chile, would you include that as part of the Belt and Road Initiative or not? I would say that the main reason why Didi is entering the Latin American market is because of they see as an investment opportunity, right? Rather than trying to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I do think that the Belt and Road Initiative is definitely be more clear in Southeast Asia. And I showed in my presentation, as you can see, since like 2019, how the Chinese investment has been decreasing in certain regions such as North America, but going more to others such as Asia. I would say that that's definitely more part or more BRI driven than what's been happening in Latin America, at least from my perspective.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio, por esa respuesta. Y tengo una pregunta, perdón, para Longyan, y que dice, sorry, let me see here. Is China interested in institutional stability or political stability? I am concerned on the fact that China is and authoritarian and might want to deal with like-minded or similar regimes. What is your take on this? This is a question from Hernan Alberro. And there was another question regarding Venezuela. So speaking about kind of like-minded, it takes both questions in one. If you can, Longyan, address this, please.
So the answer, I guess, is pretty straightforward, yes, because this is the results that we had from our EY survey. Political stability is definitely one of the key elements for any business to develop. So I think no doubt about that. But from the other perspective of stability, let's say in terms of people, again, I think it goes to what I just mentioned throughout the presentation. It's about known and unknown. So I guess it's a stability of getting to know each other in terms of culturally connected, in order psychologically for people to feel safe, to have a fair dialogue and to have a good negotiation in terms of the business.
Thank you very much, Longyan. There's another question here for Ignacio coming from Daniel Lebetreux. It says, can you comment more on how we should view Chinese SOEs in terms of antitrust? Do the investments in Chile by Southern Grid and State Grid pose a vertical monopoly risk?
Well, that's a very good question and a very technical one as well. I cannot comment with many details because we do advise some Chinese clients, and we've been advising them in some process before the economic prosecutor, the Fiscalía Nacional Económica. And at least from their perspective, I mean, they are the technical body in charge for deciding whether a certain transaction is or not against antitrust regulation in Chile. And at least in their interpretation, there's not. So, but I would like to comment regardless that of course, and as I mentioned in my presentation, I see a risk related to Chinese state-owned enterprises. And I would say not just in the case of Chile, but there is a common opinion in Latin America that there is certain difficulty to understand the way state-owned enterprises work, and that relates to historical reasons. I mean, what does it mean to be a state-owned enterprises? What's the origin behind that? What's the meaning of having certain strategic industries in which you have a bigger role of the government? And I would say that Chinese enterprises or the Chinese system could provide further information regarding that, and that would kind of facilitate their activities or the potential projects in the region, right? Because when, for example, you see a state-owned enterprises trying to target a very specific or industry such as the mining sector or lithium or whatever, any other, trying to build hospitals in Chile, which is also critical, you would like to understand in a better way what's the structure, the management system behind that. So I would advise Chinese enterprises that they may provide further information in order for us, our system, or Peru or other Latin American countries to understand the way how state-owned enterprises or state-owned property works. And that would probably mitigate the risk of antitrust, the antitrust related risk.
Yes, Margaret, go ahead.
Could I just very quickly add to that? I think a sort of bigger question is there risk, right, in relying too heavily on China from an economic perspective, right? Be it as a trade partner or in terms of investment, and as I had mentioned previously, in certain very strategic or other, sectors. And I think you could make arguments both ways. So certainly, I mean, many countries in the region are very heavily economically dependent on the U.S., right? But the question is diversification. How important is diversification, right? And in ensuring a degree of autonomy and decision making, right, among officials in Chile or in other countries in the region. And here, I mean, this is just something really worth watching, right? During this COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen, in my view at least, a greater departure than ever from China's policy of non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign nations, although it was almost explicitly Taiwan focused, right? So really trying to encourage countries, Guyana, for example, to shut down a commercial office with Taiwan, Paraguay to cut ties with Taiwan in order to be able to, create a diplomatic bridge, is what they called it, to secure vaccines, things of this nature. And so it's much more, sort of obvious pressure on Taiwan-related policymaking than we've really seen ever in the past. And so the question is then, will that extend, right? Will that sort of pressure extend to countries that are heavily economically dependent on China, whether in terms of, influence on their own investment-related policymaking, or on broader issues such as, for example, international definitions of human rights or internet governance or things of that nature. And so these are all questions that we're grappling with. There isn't a lot of concrete evidence at the moment, but these are obviously things that have been on the mind of some in Chile and are on the mind of some in other parts of the region as well, to various degrees. And so just something to keep in the back of one's mind.
Thank you very much, Margaret. There's another question. There's a broad question. It says that from Gustavo Díaz. It says, ¿está Chile preparado para recibir una significativa inversión china? No sé si Ignacio o Longyan, de acuerdo a la experiencia de ustedes, ¿cómo ven?
Longyan, maybe you want to start, Longyan, or?
Sure. Look, from our experience, we definitely find a lot of Chinese investment are looking for local partners, and across broad range of different industries, EY have customers. We definitely see an interest, and in the sense that they are interested in exploring, interested of co-invest or even set up companies together here in Chile. And I think from at least private sector, yes, I completely agree. Now, from the public sector, what are the policies? What are the next government is going to reform, change? And I think that can set a different tone for the capacity of investment to receive. In the presentation of the statistics of Ignacio presented in Brazil and in Peru, I definitely see the market potential where the Chinese are interested in going. Now, Chile as well, it's very attractive, but I guess it depends on what are the policies, what are the tone of voice the government is going to set, and if one another is going to adapt. But definitely from the private sector, they are both interested in getting to know each other and to explore opportunities together in Chile and across Latin America together.
Thank you, Longyan. I mean, I just want to add that, of course, I mean, I think that we are prepared for receiving further and bigger amounts of Chinese investment. I don't see any reason why we would make like a big distinction between a capital coming from China or some others coming from Australia, the US, or Europe, right? And in the recent experience so far involving both state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, when you, I don't know where are you going with when you're trying to ask whether we are prepared to receive a lot of Chinese investment. So far, Chinese investment in our country, they've been complying with most of the regulation. I mean, from labor, from compliance standards, from corporate tax. So I definitely think that there's still a big room for receiving more Chinese investment. And one of the reasons why I think that is because I would say that the institutions of Chile are very well prepared to receive foreign investment. We've been receiving foreign investment for decades. We are kind of like an OFDI country. We need foreign investment, and I wouldn't find many reasons why we wouldn't be prepared for receiving Chinese investment, keep receiving Chinese investment in the future. If you see, for example, both state-owned enterprises, private enterprises that are taking part, even in like public biddings, you will see that their own standards, like technological standards, are pretty high, right? So again, I don't find many reasons why we wouldn't be prepared to receive, or our system wouldn't be prepared to receive more Chinese investment. I mean, I hope we will be receiving more Chinese or Canadian or Japanese or American foreign investment, because the system is stable and we are an open country, and it's been structured from the very beginning in a way to receive a big amounts of foreign investment.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio. Y hay una pregunta que yo creo que tiene un poco el tema de la confianza de esta inversión o potencial inversión de China en ciertos sectores en Chile, y es de Christian Stott, que dice: The Chinese hydroelectric power plant model of 15 million watts can be used in Chile, Latin America, by modernizing the current obsolete plants like Colbún, Ralco, Rapel, Endesa, CGE, Citocopper. I don't know if you have an idea of.
I mean, myself, I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so maybe Pierre or Longyan, they would comment on that. I don't know. Thank you.
It's beyond my pay grade.
Well, it was a very specific question, so never mind. It's just reflects the worrisome that exist along some of these investments in infrastructure in a region. There's another question here that says, from Eric Chen, says, could you help us understand how China engages with the LAC region at the local municipal levels, if there is any kind of engagement? I don't know if you have that experience, Pierre, in Canada, at the local level, municipal levels, or it's only state to state or big companies.
No, they are all over the place. I know Margaret knows a great deal more about these relationships, but in Canada, of course, if it's a major investment, it has to go through the federal government whenever it gets to be important. And then we have a federation, the provinces, laws and regulatory system kicks in as well. So you have like 3 levels, but obviously you will have, the Chinese getting directly in touch sometimes with municipalities and all that, but they have to go through the other filters as well.
I can add very briefly to that. It happens through all sorts of different mechanisms and all sorts of different channels. There are wide-ranging actors in China that are in many cases, responsible for making these connections at the local level. These include companies themselves, and some of, the top tech companies are very, very well equipped, having offices across, South America to do this, creating, all sorts of relationships with mayors, with other sort of governors, other local level leaders, and facilitating deals at those levels. Often it depends on the degree to which a country is federalized, right? System is federalized, and how much decision-making authority is afforded to governors and mayors, and what the approval process indeed is like, whether it requires national approval for certain types of deals. In other cases, these things are struck at the central government level, right? But then by higher ranking authorities, but then are implemented at the local level. And so you'll see a lot of the sort of surveillance technology activity done that way through ministries of interior, right, and Huawei, for example, and then implemented in sort of test cases across the country. But again, I would say, it's really critical to understand that this indeed is also co-produced, right? It's not that China is always coming to the region and offering things to mayors. It's that mayors and indeed governors are reaching out. Gerardo Morales in Argentina is a perfect example of this in Jujuy province, right? Who has in fact initiated much of that activity at the local level in that particular instance. So it's very wide ranging. If you want to read more about it, I wrote a paper called Going Local, and it explains all of the mechanisms through which this happens.
It is so much the same in Canada, Margaret, and a lot of it, I like very much your expression co-produced, because you wouldn't know how many provincial premiers beyond the federal government. In Canada, provincial premiers, many of them go 5 times a year to China, and mayors as well. So I like your expression of co-produced, because much of it really comes from initiatives from local authorities.
Actually, I thought add on the point mentioned about the exchanges. Me personally, I'm from a city called Suzhou, and that was there is a Suzhou Singapore Industry Park that was initially started in the early 1990s and introduced basically with all the methodology, all the success story of Singapore into my city. And everybody have found memories of all that building process, because it's not only learning about the other country's successful stories, but at the same time, definitely create very, let's say, cultural bridge between two cities. And I remember the amount of people who traveled to Singapore when we were in summer holidays were a huge amount, because people were just curious, who is this country who associated with our city? So I think it would be interesting to explore that, maybe with Santiago.
Well, that's you leave us some homework to do, Longyan. I just wanted to, well, voy a cambiar al español. Ya hemos llegado a casi la hora y media de nuestro webinar. Quisiera agradecerle a todos por su participación. Quisiera nuevamente darle las gracias al expresidente Frey, que ha estado acompañándonos en este webinar. No sé si quiere decir algunas palabras, presidente. Le abrimos el micrófono, no sé si ahí está.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Loreto. Yo he estado escuchando muy atentamente esta reunión. Me parece estupendo que se hagan este tipo de seminarios, porque sirven para ver la realidad que estamos viviendo, cómo estamos pasando la pandemia y cómo viene en el futuro. Quiero precisar algunas cosas. El año 94, en la primera cumbre de las Américas, firmamos el acuerdo para ingresar al Acuerdo de América del Norte. Estados Unidos, México y Canadá. Estados Unidos se demoró 10 años. Recién con Estados Unidos vinimos a firmar el acuerdo el año 94. El Congreso de Estados Unidos nos negó el fast track hasta que hubo cambio del presidente Clinton y tardamos 10 años en llegar a acuerdo con Estados Unidos. Mientras tanto, y me alegra saludar al profesor y destacado representante de la Fundación de Canadá, primer país del mundo desarrollado que firmó con Chile un acuerdo de TLC, pionero en esa época, en el año 96 lo firmamos en Ottawa. Firmamos un tratado pionero también con México y con la mayoría de los países latinoamericanos. Firmamos con la Unión Europea el año 96 en Florencia para demostrar nuestra apertura, y por eso es en qué estamos hoy día. Yo sé que el tema de China a algunos preocupa, pero es evidente que al principio no habían inversiones. El tratado con China recién lo firmamos el año 2005 y después vinieron todos los tratados de protección de inversiones, doble tributación que han ido aumentando. Pero, ¿qué es lo que vemos hoy día? El 94, cuando me tocó asumir, ingresar a PEC y hacer toda esta apertura comercial de Chile, hoy día tenemos más de 60 tratados con el mundo, con 60 países. Estamos casi tocando el 80 al 90% de la población mundial y del PIB mundial. Y por eso Chile ha crecido en eso. Y parte del desarrollo de Chile ha sido su apertura al mundo exterior. Y esa apertura, al mismo tiempo, la hacemos hacia nuestro país. Porque nosotros tenemos que recibir inversiones. Tenemos que tener la posibilidad. Chile es un país de 19 millones de habitantes. No somos potencia mundial en ningún aspecto, salvo en astronomía. Y por eso hoy día tenemos grandes acuerdos astronómicos con varios países, incluido China, que tiene aquí astrónomos y que estamos viendo la posibilidad de hacer un centro astronómico chino en el norte, o acuerdos antárticos como tenemos. Pero en materia de inversión, Chile no se puede dar el lujo de estar vetando a ningún país. Si los países cumplen con las normas que tiene Chile, las normas regulatorias, y muy bien lo ha explicado nuestro destacado abogado Ignacio Tornero, aquí no se hace discriminación y no podemos hacerla, porque si no, no tendríamos inversiones. si los países respetan la legislación chilena, y permítanme, es distinto hablar de Venezuela que hablar de Chile con respecto a la relación con China. Ya sabemos lo que es, un narcoestado que China pone plata o otros países. Ya sabemos cómo es eso, no lo podemos comparar con Chile ni con otros países. Pero también quiero decir que hoy día tenemos desarrollo en muchos temas con los países de asiáticos, no solo con China, con Japón y Corea. Japón y Corea sumados representan más comercio exterior para Chile que toda la Unión Europea completa. Aquí no se ha hablado de Japón. Japón es un país que invierte mucho en Chile. Las cifras actuales representan más de 30.000 millones de dólares, que para Chile es una gran cantidad y muy diversificado. Pero hoy día también necesitamos en los temas de energía, estamos con el hidrógeno verde, ya hay 3 países, Alemania, Japón y Corea, que quieren y se han presentado a propuestas que hemos hecho ya para el hidrógeno verde. Pero, mientras tanto, Estados Unidos, hace 3 años, lo digo con toda tranquilidad, hace 3 años no tiene embajador en Chile. 3 años que Estados Unidos no tiene embajador en Chile. Saquemos la gran minería del cobre. La gran minería del cobre son las grandes transnacionales donde están todos los países del mundo, o la gran mayoría de las grandes potencias, tanto en su propiedad como en su instalación en Chile y en los principales países de minería. Pero otra cosa es todas las inversiones que estamos haciendo en energía alternativa, lo que estamos haciendo en transporte y distribución eléctrica, lo que estamos haciendo en telecomunicaciones. Estamos partiendo con el 5G, queremos fibra óptica, porque para ir al Asia o para ir al norte tenemos que ir por la fibra óptica que vienen del norte y ahí nos quedamos bloqueados porque no tenemos ninguna posibilidad y por eso queremos fibra óptica en el Pacífico Sur, porque es la manera de acercarnos al Asia y a todos los países de ASEAN y a todos los países con que estamos haciendo negocios. También tenemos 3 bancos chinos instalados en Chile. Aquí se vende y se comercia con renminbi. Somos el único país latinoamericano que ayuda a las pequeñas y medianas empresas que no tienen que estar cambiando las monedas duras. Hoy día el renminbi es una moneda dura, está en el contexto internacional, y eso también el cuarto banco es el Banco de Hong Kong. O sea, hemos hecho las cosas bien, las hemos hecho. Desde el punto de vista político, la discusión en todos los países, cada gobierno que llega toma sus decisiones, pero este país durante 30 años ha tomado un camino en materia de comercio exterior que significa que hace el año 94, 1/3 del comercio exterior era con Estados Unidos, el otro tercio era con la Unión Europea y el otro tercio América Latina. Hoy día el Asia representa más del 60% de todo el comercio exterior de Chile y además, durante la pandemia ha crecido con varios de esos países. Esa es la verdadera realidad que estamos viviendo. Y el One Belt, One Road es importante para nosotros. Desde el punto de vista, no es igual que en Europa, no es la ruta de la seda aquí. Para nosotros es infraestructura, puertos de gran escala que no tenemos, y es comunicaciones, telecomunicaciones que necesitamos para estar conectados al mundo ya, que somos un país abierto, que respeta las reglas, que se respetan las reglas en Chile, y los tratados nos sirven para eso, para nivelar la cancha. Yo lo he recordado muchas veces que cuando empezamos a negociar con China, nos decían, póngale todas las condiciones a China, si no, no firme nada. Lo que necesitábamos eran los tratados, porque cuando hay un país de 19 millones contra países como India, China, Japón o Corea, que son potencias mundiales, necesitamos los tratados porque eso nivela los temas regulatorios para poder competir a nivel de un país pequeño que quiere estar presente en el mundo con todo su sistema de comercio exterior. Así que podría comentar muchas cosas más, pero lo que más me preocupa es la actitud de Estados Unidos con Chile. Desde muchos años conozco la historia de la relación de Chile con Estados Unidos desde el gobierno del presidente Frei Montalva, con las famosas actuaciones de Estados Unidos en Centroamérica. Y así, y en el caso nuestro, 10 años se demoró Estados Unidos, 3 años sin embajador. ¿Qué señales son esas? Espero que el presidente Biden las cambie, porque son malas señales para nuestro comercio exterior y para nuestra realidad y para nuestras inversiones, que las necesitamos para resolver nuestros problemas. Por último, la pandemia. Chile hoy día tiene 80% con primera dosis, 60% con segunda dosis. ¿Por qué? Porque hicimos los convenios. Evidentemente, gracias a todos los acuerdos que tenemos con Chile, que somos socios estratégicos, casi el 70% de las vacunas que hemos recibido son con Chile. Y por eso estamos entre los, creo que hoy día en la estadística, el tercer país del mundo que tiene más alto nivel de cobertura de rebaño. Sin llegar, y dentro de un mes o 2 meses más, estaremos cubiertos con el 100% de las vacunaciones. Y eso se ha debido a la disposición de los países y a la disposición de China para vendernos vacunas que iniciamos del comienzo. Así que me alegro de esta conversación muy útil. La próxima vez, si tomamos un poquito más de tiempo, porque se han tocado muchos temas aquí en esta conversación. Agradecer a Canadá, que siempre ha tenido la confianza en Chile, pero hay muchas otras opiniones que hay que cuidar, porque Chile es un país pequeño y no se puede dar el lujo de vetar a nadie en el mundo, ni en el comercio exterior, ni en las inversiones. Siempre que respeten nuestra legislación. Aquí no hay mucha inversión china ahora, tal como decía Ignacio, ha llegado muchas inversiones, han entrado en concesiones, han entrado en licitaciones de concesiones de autopistas, de hospitales, de obras de regadío, empresas chinas que antes no lo hacían. Los convencimos en los Chile Week que hicimos en el Asia, para entender, y por eso que hay muchos países del Asia que están invirtiendo también en concesiones, respetando nuestra legislación. Y eso es conveniente para Chile y lo tenemos que seguir haciendo. Así que muchas gracias por esta invitación, porque ayuda a aclarar las cosas y a ver cómo nos vamos a manejar en la pospandemia, que es muy complejo para un país pequeño como el nuestro. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a usted, presidente, por compartir su opinión. Definitivamente hay muchas cosas más que seguir compartiendo, discutiendo. Esa es la idea de nuestros webinars y veo que logramos nuestro objetivo en cierta medida. Esperamos tenerlo en los próximos webinars que vamos a organizar. Vamos a ver con Margaret desde ya, a ver qué organizamos alrededor de la relación Estados Unidos-Chile. Parece que hay tareas pendientes, así que muchas gracias, presidente, y nada más despedirme de ustedes. Voy a hacer un gesto asiático para pedir disculpas por los contratiempos al inicio de este webinar, cosa que nunca nos había pasado. Hago mi acto de contrición. Les agradezco mucho a todos por su audiencia, los esperamos como siempre, y que tengan un muy buen día. Muchas gracias a Ignacio, a Longyan, Pierre, muchísimas gracias. Y Margaret, desde ya, muchas gracias por trabajar junto a nosotros, nuestra fundación. El Inter-American Dialogue es un gran partner, estamos muy contentos con esto. Gracias, presidente, de nuevo, y los esperamos en una próxima oportunidad. Hasta luego.
Gracias.